September 2nd, 1945. USS Missouri, Tokyo Bay. The morning sun climbed over the steel-gray waters of Tokyo Bay, casting long shadows across the deck of the battleship USS Missouri. The air carried the smell of salt and oil, diesel exhaust from the hundreds of Allied vessels that crowded the harbor, and something else, the acrid residue of a war that had consumed the Pacific for nearly 4 years. On the Verkami deck, beneath the 16-inch gun turrets that had bombarded Japanese positions from Iwo Jima to Okinawa, a small delegation of Japanese officers stood in formal uniform, their faces composed into masks of dignity despite the humiliation of the moment. Among them was Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the pilot who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, now present to witness the instrument of his nation's surrender. The ceremony would take 11 minutes, but in the days and weeks that followed, as Japanese military personnel surrendered across the Pacific, as pilots climbed down from aircraft they would never fly again, as sailors evacuated ships they had expected to die defending, they encountered something that shattered their understanding of what defeat meant. American officers saluted them, not with mockery, not with contempt, but with the formal military courtesy reserved for warriors who had fought with honor. The gesture was incomprehensible. It was, for many, more devastating than any bomb. The Japanese military had prepared its personnel for death, but not for respect. From the moment a young man entered service, whether through conscription or the more prestigious path of volunteer aviation, he was indoctrinated into a warrior culture that stretched back centuries to the samurai code of Bushido. Death in battle was the highest honor. Surrender was the ultimate disgrace, a stain that could never be washed away, a shame that extended to family and ancestors. The military field code, the Senjin-kun, promulgated in 1941, made this explicit. Do not live in shame as a prisoner. Die to ensure you do not leave a bad name behind. Soldiers and sailors were issued grenades specifically for suicide if capture became inevitable. Pilots were taught that their aircraft were instruments of the Emperor's will, to be used until destruction. The concept of honorable surrender, of maintaining dignity in defeat, simply did not exist in the framework they had been given. Capture meant you had failed at the fundamental task of dying properly. This ideology had produced the phenomenon that terrified American forces throughout the Pacific War, the unwillingness of Japanese soldiers to surrender under any circumstances. At Saipan, in July 1944, thousands of Japanese civilians had leaped from cliffs rather than accept American occupation, convinced by their military that the Americans would torture and murder them. At Iwo Jima, in early 1945, of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, fewer than 200 allowed themselves to be captured, and many of those were unconscious from wounds. At Okinawa, the final major battle before the atomic bombs, Japanese resistance continued for 82 days of the most brutal fighting in the Pacific, ending only when the commanding general committed ritual suicide. American forces had learned to expect no quarter and give none. The war had become a grinding campaign of extermination, island by island, cave by cave, where the enemy would fight literally to the last man. The psychological impact on American servicemen was profound. The recognition that they were fighting an enemy who viewed death as preferable to the dishonor of survival created a unique horror that veterans would carry for decades. Lieutenant Toshio Hashimoto had believed all of it. He had graduated from the Naval Academy at Etajima in 1940, in the same class as many of the pilots who would attack Pearl Harbor 15 months later. He had trained in the Nakajima B-5N torpedo bomber, mastering the difficult art of low-level attack runs, learning to judge wind speed and distance with only seconds to react. He had been indoctrinated in the spiritual superiority of Japanese warriors, in the divine mission to liberate Asia from Western colonialism, in the inevitable triumph of will over material. When he flew his first combat mission in June 1942, attacking American positions at Midway, he had felt invincible. The carrier force that launched him represented the most powerful naval aviation in the world. They had destroyed the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. They had conquered the Philippines, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies. They had won every battle. Victory was destiny. Then, in 5 minutes, 3 American carriers had been set ablaze by dive bombers from the USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown. Hashimoto had watched from his cockpit as the Akagi, flagship of the carrier division, erupted in flames as bombs detonated ammunition and fuel stores. He had seen the Kaga explode, the Soryu list, and burn. He had landed on the Hiryu, the only carrier still operational, and had taken off again for a revenge strike that accomplished nothing. By evening, Hiryu too was burning. The Empire's first-line carrier force had been destroyed in a single afternoon. The war, though no one could admit it publicly, was effectively lost at that moment. Everything that followed, Guadalcanal, the Solomons, the grinding retreat across the Pacific, was delaying action, buying time for a miracle that never came. But the military could not tell its personnel that the war was lost. It could not explain that they were dying for a cause already defeated. Instead, it doubled down on the ideology of sacrifice, on the promise that spirit would overcome material, that death in service to the emperor was its own reward. Hashimoto flew through 3 more years of war. He survived battles that killed most of his classmates. He flew from carriers until there were no carriers left, then from land bases that grew progressively closer to the home islands as American forces advanced. He watched the quality of replacement pilots decline as experienced aviators died and training was shortened. By 1944, new pilots arrived at forward bases with barely 50 hours of flight time, incapable of landing on carriers at night, unable to navigate beyond visual range. They died within weeks, sometimes days. The Americans, meanwhile, seemed to grow stronger. Their aircraft improved, faster, more heavily armed, equipped with technology that gave them advantages in range and accuracy. Their pilots rotated home, after tours of duty, then returned with more experience. Their carriers multiplied impossibly. Intelligence had said America could build perhaps 3 carriers per year. Instead, Essex-class carriers were appearing at a rate of nearly 1 per month, along with dozens of smaller escort carriers. The tonnage of shipping the Americans produced exceeded all projections. The number of aircraft they manufactured was beyond anything Japanese industry could match. Hashimoto flew against formations of 50, then 100, then 300 enemy aircraft, all supported by radar-directed anti-aircraft fire that created killing zones around the American fleet. By August 1945, Hashimoto was stationed at a Kanoya Air Base on Kyushu, the southernmost home island, flying one of the few remaining operational aircraft. His mission, had the invasion come, would have been kamikaze. There was no longer fuel for training, no longer expectation of survival. Aircraft were reserved for one-way missions. Pilots were told they would strike a blow for the emperor, that their sacrifice would sink enough invasion ships to make the Americans negotiate rather than conquer. It was a fantasy, but it was the only fantasy left. Then came Hiroshima on August 6th, Nagasaki on August 9th, and the Soviet declaration of war that same day. The empire collapsed. On August 15th, the emperor's voice, never before heard by common citizens, crackled over radio speakers across Japan, announcing in oblique language that the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, and that the empire would endure the unendurable and suffer the insufferable by accepting the Allied surrender terms. Hashimoto listened in the barracks at Kanoya with 24 other pilots. Several wept openly. 2 left the room and committed suicide that afternoon. Others sat in stunned silence, unable to process that the divine empire was defeated, that the emperor himself had acknowledged it, that they would not die in battle after all. The following weeks existed in a strange twilight. The formal surrender ceremony was September the 2nd, but the mechanics of actually surrendering hundreds of thousands of troops scattered across the Pacific took months. At Kanoya, American occupation forces arrived in late September. Hashimoto had expected execution, or at minimum brutal treatment. He had been told throughout the war that Americans took no prisoners, that they mutilated the dead, that they were barbaric gangsters who would enslave the Japanese population. These stories were propaganda, but they had been repeated so often, reinforced by genuine atrocities on both sides, that many believed them. When the first American troops arrived, Marines from the occupation force, Hashimoto and his fellow pilots stood in formation on the airfield, uncertain what would happen. They had been ordered to surrender their swords, the symbol of the officer class. For a samurai descendant, handing over the family blade was the ultimate humiliation, a symbolic death. But the order came from the emperor, transmitted through the chain of command, and therefore had to be obeyed. What happened next became seared into Hashimoto's memory, with the clarity of trauma. The American commander, a Marine colonel named Robert Blake, inspected the assembled Japanese officers. His face was hard, aged beyond his years by battles across the Pacific. He had fought at Guadalcanal, at Tarawa, where the Marines suffered devastating casualties in the first hours, at Peleliu, where the fighting had gone house to house through ruined cities. He had every reason to hate the men standing before him. Instead, when the Japanese commanding officer presented his sword in surrender, Colonel Blake accepted it, then rendered a formal salute. The gesture was crisp, professional, the same salute he would give to his own superior officers. Around him, the Marines followed suit, saluting the assembled Japanese officers before collecting their weapons. The symbolism was unmistakable. You fought with courage. You are defeated but not dishonored. You are soldiers, like us. Hashimoto felt something break inside himself. He had been prepared for contempt, for revenge, for the treatment that Japanese forces had often inflicted on captured enemies. Instead, he received acknowledgment. The Americans were saying, without words, that the war had been between nations and ideologies, not between personal enemies, that defeat did not erase the courage required to fight. It was a concept alien to Japanese military culture, where defeat was absolute shame. The Japanese had not saluted American prisoners at Bataan. They had marched them through jungles without food or water, killing those who fell. Japanese guards at POW camps had enforced discipline through beatings and executions, viewing the prisoners as less than human because they had surrendered. The contrast was devastating. It suggested that everything Hashimoto had been taught about American barbarism was inverted, that perhaps his own side had been the barbarians. The cognitive dissonance was crushing. This scene repeated across the Pacific, with variations as scattered Japanese garrisons surrendered. On Wake Island, Japanese troops who had held the tiny atoll since December 1941 marched out to surrender. In October 1945, expecting execution for the American prisoners they had massacred in 1943. Instead, they were processed, fed, given medical treatment. On Truk, the major Japanese naval base in the Carolines, thousands of stranded Navy personnel surrendered their weapons and were assembled for repatriation. At remote outposts in the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies, Japanese soldiers who had been cut off for months emerged from jungles to find that the war had ended, that they were not to be killed, but transported home. The consistent element was the professionalism of American forces, the adherence to formal military protocol that granted dignity even in defeat. It was psychological warfare of an unusual kind, warfare through unexpected decency, through the demonstration that the weak and enemy's propaganda had been false, that the American system produced not barbarism, but discipline and law even in victory. The symbolic power of the salute as a gesture of respect became a recurring element in the surrender process, particularly in the interactions between pilots. Aviation, even in the brutality of the Pacific War, retained some of the chivalric tradition from the First World War, the recognition that flying was difficult and dangerous, that those who mastered it belonged to a select brotherhood regardless of national allegiance. When Japanese pilots surrendered at air bases across the home islands, they often encountered American pilots who had fought against them, who knew the specifications of the Zero fighter and the Betty bomber, who had studied Japanese tactics and developed counters. These Americans understood what it meant to be a combat pilot: the constant proximity to death, the loss of friends, the skill required to survive. Their salutes carried a different weight than those of ground troops. They were acknowledgments between professionals, between men who had tried to kill each other in the air and who now faced each other across the divide of victory and defeat. At Atsugi Air Base near Tokyo, which became one of the primary entry points for American occupation forces, a delegation of Japanese naval aviators surrendered their aircraft in early September. Among them was Saburo Sakai, one of the war's leading aces with 64 confirmed kills, a pilot so skilled that he had survived being shot through the head in a 1942 engagement and had flown his damaged aircraft 560 miles back to base half-blind. Sakai had expected to die defending the homeland. Instead, he stood on the tarmac watching American transport aircraft land, enormous C-54s that dwarfed anything in the Japanese inventory, disgorging troops and supplies in quantities that seemed impossible. When he formally surrendered to the American Air Liaison Officer, a Navy commander named James Flatley, who was himself an ace, Flatley reviewed Sakai's logbook, noted his combat record, and saluted him with visible respect. "You were a hell of a pilot," Flatley said through a translator. The words were simple, but their impact was profound. Sakai had been prepared to be treated as a war criminal. Instead, he was being acknowledged as a warrior by another warrior. Years later, Sakai would write that this moment began his transformation from militant nationalist to advocate for peace and reconciliation between Japan and America. The food, as at the German POW camps, became a recurring symbol of American material abundance that challenged Japanese understanding of the war. Surrendered personnel were processed through reception centers where they were deloused, medically examined, and fed. The meals were substantial: rice, but also bread, canned meat, vegetables, fruit, coffee, sometimes candy. Many Japanese soldiers had not seen such food in months. The home islands were starving by summer 1945, the result of submarine blockade that had cut off food imports, Allied bombing that had destroyed transportation infrastructure, and the conscription of agricultural labor for military purposes. Urban civilians were surviving on rations of 1,050 calories per day, supplemented by anything edible: weeds, bark, insects. The military had priority access to food, but even that was limited. Soldiers surrendering from the home islands were often malnourished. Those from isolated Pacific garrisons were in worse condition, having survived on jungle foraging and reduced rations for months. The contrast hit Hashimoto during his first meal in American custody: a lunch of rice, beef stew from cans, bread with butter, an apple, and coffee. He stared at the tray, trying to reconcile it with the propaganda about American weakness and resource depletion. Japan had entered the war partly because of resource scarcity, particularly oil and rubber embargoed by the United States. The military had justified the expansion into Southeast Asia as necessary to secure resources for survival. The Americans, they were told, were too weak and divided to fight a long war, that early victories would force negotiation. But here was evidence to the contrary. An enemy that could feed its defeated foes better than Japan had fed its own troops suggested a level of productive capacity that the propaganda had systematically underestimated. Hashimoto thought of his own rations as a pilot: rice with occasional fish or pickles, tea, sometimes a piece of chocolate on special occasions. He thought of civilians he had seen in Japanese cities, hollow-eyed children, elderly searching through rubble for anything salvageable. And he thought of the B-29 crews he had tried to intercept, flying in formations of hundreds, each aircraft representing tons of aluminum and high-grade fuel, escorted by fighters with range that shouldn't have been possible. All of it produced by an industrial economy that apparently operated at a scale beyond Japanese comprehension. The realization of having been lied to about American weakness, about Japanese superiority, about the likelihood of victory, spread through the surrendered troops like a virus. In the processing centers, in the barracks where they waited for repatriation ships, in the quiet conversations between men who had served together, the same themes emerged. Why had they been told America was weak when the evidence contradicted it? Why had their leaders continued the war for 2 years after it was clearly lost? Why had they been prepared to die in kamikaze attacks when the outcome was inevitable? Some men retreated into denial, insisting that Japan had been betrayed by incompetent leadership, or that victory had been possible if only certain battles had gone differently. Others fell into deep depression, the structure of meaning that had organized their lives revealed as hollow. A significant number began the painful process of reassessing everything they had believed, using the gap between what they had been told and what they were experiencing as a wedge to pry open their indoctrination. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the Pearl Harbor attack leader present at the Missouri surrender ceremony, underwent one of the more dramatic transformations. In the months after surrender, Fuchida struggled with the question of why Japan had lost. He obtained copies of American after-action reports through occupation authorities, studying the battles he had participated in from the enemy perspective. What struck him was the professionalism, the lack of racial hatred in the tactical analyses, the respect for Japanese skill and courage, even as American forces developed methods to counter them. At Midway, American dive bomber pilots described the courage of Japanese carriers continuing to launch aircraft even while under attack. At Coral Sea, American analysts noted the skill of Japanese torpedo bombers. The Americans wrote about their enemy as professionals analyzing other professionals, not as propaganda caricatures. This contrasted sharply with Japanese military documents, which often attributed American successes to luck or material advantage, never granting that the enemy might be tactically innovative or strategically competent. Fuchida's transformation accelerated in 1947 when he encountered an American Christian missionary and began studying theology. By 1950, he had converted to Christianity and become an evangelical preacher, traveling to the United States to speak at churches about reconciliation and forgiveness. His message was that the war had been a tragedy produced by ideological blindness, that both nations had suffered unnecessarily, that the path forward required acknowledgment of shared humanity. His conversion was controversial in Japan, where many viewed it as collaboration or betrayal. But Fuchida understood it as liberation from the ideology that had turned him into an instrument of death, that had made him complicit in starting a war that killed millions. The American salute he witnessed on the Missouri, the formal acknowledgment of defeated enemies as still possessing dignity, had planted a seed that grew into full rejection of militarism. Not all Japanese personnel underwent such dramatic ideological shifts. For many, the transition was subtler, less about conversion than about adaptation. They accepted defeat as reality, adjusted to occupation, eventually to independence and democracy, without necessarily embracing American values. Some maintained bitter resentment about the atomic bombs, about the fire bombings that had killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, about what they saw as American hypocrisy in lecturing Japan about war crimes while having committed its own. These feelings were valid and widespread, especially among civilians who had suffered through the bombing campaigns. But even among the resentful, there was grudging acknowledgment that the occupation could have been far worse, that the Americans could have enacted revenge and instead chose reconstruction, that General MacArthur's administration, for all its flaws and paternalism, had implemented reforms that many Japanese came to value: land reform that broke up feudal estates, women's suffrage, labor rights, educational modernization, and most importantly, a constitution that renounced war and established democratic governance. The salutes, the food, the professional military courtesy extended to defeated enemies. These became elements in a larger strategy of occupation and transformation that American planners had learned from the failures after World War I. The decision to treat surrendered Japanese personnel with formal respect was not accidental or merely humanitarian. It was calculated to achieve specific goals: to discourage continued resistance, to delegitimize the militarist ideology that had justified the war, to demonstrate that American power did not require cruelty, and to plant the foundations for an eventual partnership rather than permanent enmity. The strategy worked unevenly and incompletely, but it worked well enough. Japan did not become a source of insurgent resistance during occupation. Japanese civilians did not wage guerrilla warfare against American troops, despite having been prepared to do so. The transformation from militarist empire to pacifist democracy occurred with remarkable speed, aided by the emperor's cooperation, by the retention of civil bureaucracy, by land reform that addressed rural poverty, but also by the simple fact that American behavior contradicted the propaganda that had sustained the war effort. Toshio Hashimoto returned to Japan in December 1945 aboard a transport ship crowded with repatriated soldiers and sailors. The voyage took 2 weeks, during which he spent most of his time on deck staring at the ocean, trying to process what had happened to his life. He was 27 years old. He had spent 5 years at war. He had killed enemy sailors and airmen, had watched friends die, had accepted that he would die violently in service to the emperor. Instead, he was alive, returning to a country he barely recognized from descriptions in the letters that had reached him before surrender. His parents' home in Osaka had been destroyed in the March 1945 firebombing. His younger brother had died. On Okinawa, his sister had been conscripted for factory work and had lost an arm in an industrial accident. Japan was occupied, disarmed, economically devastated, politically transformed. Everything he had fought for was gone. He found his mother living in a refugee barracks on the outskirts of Osaka, among hundreds of thousands of displaced persons who had lost homes to bombing. They recognized each other, but did not embrace. Neither had the emotional capacity left. They simply stood facing each other, survivors of a catastrophe neither fully understood. Over the following months, Hashimoto found work as a translator for the occupation authorities. His English learned through technical manuals, making him valuable. He helped process repatriation paperwork, assisted in coordinating food distribution, served as liaison between Japanese civil authorities and American military government. The work was mundane but necessary, and it gave him daily exposure to American personnel. Young men, mostly, many of them as bewildered by occupation duty as the Japanese were by defeat. He noticed that most showed no particular hostility, that they were bored and homesick rather than vengeful, that they handed out candy to Japanese children and helped elderly civilians with heavy loads, that they seemed genuinely interested in Japanese culture and history. This ordinariness was itself remarkable. These were the enemy. They should have been monsters. They were just people. In 1947, Hashimoto enrolled at Tokyo University, using funds from the GI Bill equivalent that MacArthur's administration had created for demobilized Japanese servicemen. He studied engineering, graduated in 1951, and eventually worked for companies involved in Japan's industrial recovery. He married, had children, lived through the transformation of Japan from occupied ruins to economic power. He never flew again, never wanted to, but he kept his pilot's logbook, and in later years he would occasionally take it out and read through the entries. Missions flown, aircraft types, targets, results. A record of 5 years spent trying to kill people who, it turned out, were not so different from himself. In the 1970s, he participated in veteran reconciliation meetings where former American and Japanese pilots met to discuss their experiences. At one such meeting in Hawaii, he encountered a man who had flown dive bombers off the Enterprise at Midway. They compared notes, realized they had been in the same piece of sky on June 4, 1942, trying to kill each other. They shook hands, then embraced. Two old men crying for the young men they had been, for the friends they had lost, for the years wasted on a war that should never have been fought. The photograph taken on the Missouri during the surrender ceremony became one of the defining images of the Pacific War's end. It shows the Japanese delegation standing on the deck in formal uniform, top hats and morning coats, facing the rows of Allied officers and the cameras documenting the moment. The Japanese faces are composed but strained, bearing the weight of national humiliation. General MacArthur stands at the microphone delivering his speech. "It is my earnest hope, indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past, a world founded upon faith and understanding, a world dedicated to the dignity of man and the fulfillment of his most cherished wish for freedom, tolerance, and justice." The words were propagandistic, paternalistic, typical of MacArthur's grandiose style, but they also articulated the strategic objective, not merely to defeat Japan, but to transform it, to offer an alternative to militarism, to demonstrate that the victor could be magnanimous without being weak. That demonstration continued in the details of occupation policy. War crimes trials at Tokyo and other venues held military and civilian leaders accountable for aggression and atrocities, executing men like General Tojo and imprisoning thousands of others. But the trials distinguished between leaders and followers, between those who made policy and those who executed orders. Regular soldiers and sailors were not prosecuted simply for having fought. This distinction was crucial for allowing most Japanese military personnel to reintegrate into society without overwhelming guilt or stigma. Pilots like Hashimoto, who had bombed and strafed military targets, were not charged with war crimes. Even many who had participated in atrocities were allowed to return to civilian life if they were lower-ranking personnel following orders. The policy was imperfect and allowed many guilty individuals to escape justice, but it achieved the goal of making reconciliation possible for the majority of the population. the economic assistance, particularly after the initial punitive phase of occupation ended in 1947, further reinforced the message that America sought partnership rather than permanent subjugation. The reverse course in occupation policy, driven by Cold War concerns about communist expansion in Asia, led to investments in Japanese industrial recovery, to tolerance of zaibatsu business conglomerates that had been slated for dissolution, to positioning Japan as a democratic bulwark against Soviet and Chinese influence. By the time the occupation officially ended in 1952, Japan had stabilized economically and politically. The 1960s and 70s saw the economic miracle that transformed Japan into a global industrial power. The 1980s saw Japan as America's primary economic competitor. Throughout this transformation, the memory of how the occupation had been conducted, firmly but without gratuitous cruelty, with investment rather than extraction, with respect for Japanese culture even while reforming political structures, shaped the relationship between the two nations. The salute that American officers gave to defeated Japanese warriors in 1945 became symbolic of a broader policy of treating defeated enemies as potential future partners, a long-term strategic vision that the post-World War I generation had learned the hard way. Saburo Sakai, the ace pilot who received Commander Flatley's salute at Atsugi, lived until the year 2000, dying at age 84. In his later years, he wrote extensively about his war experiences and became a peace activist, arguing that military valor should be honored but war itself should be prevented. He maintained friendships with American pilots he had fought against, participating in reunions and documentary projects. In one interview in 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the war's end, he reflected on the moment of surrender. When the American commander saluted me, I realized that courage is universal, that we had both been serving our countries as we understood duty, that the war was not personal, even though it had been deadly. That salute allowed me to maintain my dignity, and maintaining dignity allowed me to change my mind about what I had believed. If they had treated us with contempt, many of us would have remained bitter. Instead, they treated us as soldiers, and that made it possible to become something other than soldiers, to become citizens of a peaceful nation. This insight, that dignity enables transformation while contempt entrenches enmity, was central to the success of American occupation policy in Japan. It was not universal in application. American treatment of Japanese Americans during the war, the internment camps that imprisoned 120,000 citizens and residents without trial, represented the opposite policy and remained a source of shame. The atomic bombings remained controversial, their necessity debated by historians and ethicists. The fire bombings that killed more than 300,000 civilians in Tokyo, Osaka, and other cities represented area bombing strategies that targeted civilian morale and industrial capacity without meaningful discrimination between combatants and non-combatants. These actions created legitimate grievances that coexisted with gratitude for the occupation's relative restraint. The relationship between America and Japan, then and since, has been complex and sometimes contradictory. Partnership built on the foundation of total war, friendship emerging from mutual slaughter, respect granted belatedly after industrial scale, killing, but the salute remained meaningful precisely because of that complexity. It acknowledged that the men who had fought with suicidal courage at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, who had flown kamikaze missions, who had died by the hundreds of thousands defending islands that strategic logic should have surrendered, were not automatons or fanatics, but human beings operating within a system that had demanded inhuman choices. The salute said, "Your courage was real, even though your cause was wrong. You fought honorably within the brutal logic of war, even though the war itself was dishonorable. You are defeated but not debased." This distinction allowed for psychological survival and eventual transformation in ways that unconditional contempt would have foreclosed. The recurring symbol of respect, the salute rendered by victors to the vanquished, became embedded in the mythology of reconciliation that both nations constructed in the decades after the war. It appeared in memoirs, in documentaries, in the ceremonies at Pearl Harbor and Hiroshima, where veterans from both sides met to remember and mourn. It represented an alternative to the cycle of revenge, an acknowledgment that wars end, and that what comes after the shooting stops matters as much as military victory. The lesson was imperfectly learned and inconsistently applied. American wars in subsequent decades often failed to implement the same long-term strategic thinking, but it remained a reference point, an example of how victors could treat defeated enemies in ways that created allies rather than permanent adversaries. Lieutenant Toshio Hashimoto died in 1998 at age 80, having lived through 3 distinct Japans: the militarist empire of his youth, the occupied nation of his young adulthood, and the economic power of his later years. In his final decade, he gave occasional talks at schools about his wartime experiences, always emphasizing the tragedy of the war, the lies that had sustained it, and the unexpected mercy of his enemies. He kept a photograph on his desk, taken at Kanoya Air Base in September 1945, showing the moment when Colonel Blake saluted the assembled Japanese officers. Hashimoto is visible in the back row, his face frozen in the confusion of that instant. When visitors asked about the photograph, he would explain what it meant to him. That moment when everything he had been taught about the enemy was revealed as propaganda. That moment when he realized that courage existed on both sides, that war was a human tragedy rather than a moral crusade. "That salute saved my life," he would say. "Not physically. I had already survived. But it saved my life in a deeper way. It allowed me to let go of the hatred, to admit I had been wrong, to become a man of peace instead of dying inside as a man of war." This interior death, the psychological destruction that comes from having one's fundamental beliefs shattered without any path to reconstruction, was what the American policy of respect in defeat helped many Japanese veterans avoid. By acknowledging their courage while defeating their cause, by granting dignity in the moment of ultimate humiliation, the occupation authorities provided a bridge between the warrior identity these men had been shaped into and the civilian identity they would need to adopt in peacetime Japan. The bridge was narrow and difficult to cross. Many fell off it into alcoholism, depression, suicide, or bitter resentment. But enough crossed successfully that Japan's transformation into a pacifist democracy became possible within a single generation. The final irony was that the policy worked because it was genuine. The American officers who saluted defeated Japanese warriors were not, for the most part, acting under orders to do so. They were extending military courtesy that they had been trained to render to fellow soldiers. The American military culture, despite its own flaws and prejudices, maintained a tradition of respect for martial valor that transcended nationality. This tradition had European roots, the chivalric codes that had governed warfare among Christian knights, the Enlightenment era, principles that led to the First Geneva Conventions, the sense that soldiers were instruments of state policy rather than personal enemies. The Pacific War had tested this tradition severely. The racial dimension, the atrocities committed by Japanese forces against prisoners and civilians, the sheer brutality of island combat, but enough of it survived that American officers could still recognize Japanese courage as authentic and worthy of acknowledgment. That recognition flowed both ways in the years after the war. Japanese veterans came to acknowledge American courage as well. The Marines who had assaulted fortified islands despite horrific casualties. The bomber crews who flew missions knowing that being shot down meant death by drowning or burning. The submariners who hunted in waters dominated by enemy air power. The mutual recognition did not erase the war's horror, did not justify the deaths or heal all wounds, but it provided a foundation for relationship that was more than victor and vanquished. It suggested the possibility, however fragile, that former enemies could become something else. Not friends exactly. The gap was too great, but partners in building a peace that honored the dead by preventing future wars. In the end, the American Fidery, salute to Japanese courage after surrender, represented a choice about what kind of victor America would be. It was a choice rooted in strategic calculation, the recognition that how one treats defeated enemies shapes whether they become future allies or eternal adversaries. But it was also a choice rooted in principle, in the belief that human dignity persists even in defeat, that courage deserves acknowledgment even when deployed in service of an unjust cause, that the goal of war is not to humiliate but to transform. The choice was not inevitable. Other victors in other wars have made different choices, have ground defeated enemies into the dirt, have enacted revenge and called it justice. The American occupation of Japan was imperfect and sometimes hypocritical, but in this particular dimension, the treatment of defeated military personnel, it achieved something remarkable. It broke the cycle that had characterized East Asian warfare for decades, the cycle of humiliation and revenge that had driven Japanese militarism in the first place. The young men who stood on airfields and ships across the Pacific in September 1945, surrendering weapons they had expected to die holding, received from their conquerors a gift they could not have anticipated: the affirmation that their courage had been real, that their service to their nation had been authentic, even as that nation's cause was rejected and defeated. The gift came in the form of a simple military salute, rendered with the same crisp formality that warriors have extended to one another across centuries and cultures. And in that gesture, in that moment of unexpected respect, lay the seed of transformation, the possibility that men trained to kill could become men who built peace, that enemies could become partners, that defeat could become the foundation for a different kind of victory. Not the victory of the battlefield, but the victory of choosing what comes after the battlefield ends, of building something new from the ruins of what had been destroyed. That possibility, planted in thousands of individual moments between former enemies, grew into the U.S.-Japan alliance that has endured for over 70 years. It grew into economic partnership and cultural exchange. It grew into joint efforts at disaster relief and humanitarian aid. It grew into the quiet work of former warriors meeting to remember and reconcile, to bear witness to suffering, to say with actions what words often fail to express: that we were both human, that we both suffered, that we can both choose peace. The salute rendered in September 1945 echoes still in every exchange between American and Japanese personnel, in every joint military exercise conducted by allies who were once mortal enemies, in every ceremony where veterans bow to one another. In mutual respect, it echoes as a reminder that how we treat those we have defeated defines us more profoundly than victory itself, that mercy and strength are not opposites, but complements, that the warriors who fight with courage deserve acknowledgment even when, especially when, they fight for causes that must be opposed and defeated.